All right, so as you can see, Hayden, would you mind hitting the lights for me? Thank you. Is that too dark? No? All right. So our lesson today, we're going to be focusing on Jim Crow and racism after the Civil War. So as you guys remember, the Jim Crow laws, these are the legal laws that segregated America, that state that white and black are separate and that we can create separate facilities for both. Okay? So prior to the Civil War, there really was not a whole lot of institutionalized racism because African Americans were not viewed as citizens. Okay? They did not have legal rights under the Constitution, so there really was no need for legal segregation or legal racism. However, after the Civil War, with the Emancipation Proclamation and African Americans gaining citizenship rights, all of a sudden we begin to see these laws and these ordinances being put forth that are curtailing or limiting their rights. Okay? So what we need to know these three amendments. Okay? These are the three amendments that provide African Americans and Americans as a whole with legal protections under the Constitution. It would be the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay? The 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolished slavery. It said that involuntary servitude or slavery is illegal within the United States. Now we'll see in a moment that they put a loophole in this amendment. There was a workaround where they could still practice certain forms of slavery, but we'll be looking at that at a later moment. Okay, so then the 14th Amendment, this granted citizenship. So in America today, if you are born on American soil, you have citizenship rights. Okay, you are a natural, we call it a natural born citizen. That means any individual who was born within American jurisdiction. At this time, this was not the case. So you had all these African Americans who had been born in America, but they did not have citizenship rights. They were not viewed legally as citizens, and this is what the 14th Amendment sought to fix. Then the 15th Amendment, this is the amendment that guaranteed that you couldn't mess with people's voting rights. Okay, and at this point in history, this does not apply to women. Women still do not have the right to vote at this time. That would happen about 60 years later. But so this Voting Act only applies to males. Okay? Oops, wrong one. So the reaction in the South to the Civil War and the Emancipation, it was violent and it was repressive. Okay, this is the time period, we often call it Reconstruction. This is when terror groups such as the Ku Klux Klan were first created. So the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan, they were a terrorist organization that sought to control African Americans through fear. Right? Prior to the Civil War, whites controlled all of society, and then all of a sudden there's 4 million people who have just become citizens, they're thrown into the mix. And whites in the South, they're worried about losing their power, so they turn to violence to control the African American population. They also use violence against whites, right? If you were a white individual who spoke up for protecting African Americans, you could be attacked by the KKK. They were non-discriminatory in who they attacked and who they targeted through violence. The only type of non-discrimination, ironically, is that they'll kill anybody, right? So again, they sought to retain control through terror. And this is the point in time where Jim Crow laws are first put forth. So Jim Crow laws are what are often called black codes. They are local and state ordinances that severely restrict freedom of African Americans. So on the federal level, with those amendments to our Constitution, the federal government is protecting, they're doing their part to protect minorities. But state and local governments, they work outside of the federal government. They have different jurisdictions, different roles. And so even though it was federally illegal, local and state governments could institute laws legally segregating and legally being racist, right? Overt racism. These laws segregated the South. So you see signs like these. You could go all throughout the South and see signs like these where they're denominating this water fountain is for white people only, this water fountain is for colored people only. There was, in train cars, there were cars that only white people could ride in. As you see, the public swimming pool should be utilized by the entirety of the town, but the sign stating it is for whites only. These are the type of things that Jim Crow laws brought about, right? Legal segregation. The rules, they also detailed or dictated where African Americans could live. They said, this town, if you are African American, you cannot live here. Or you can only live in this neighborhood of this town. Or you can only live in this type of house. It also stated how they could work. It said you can only work in these professions. You can only work on these days. Right? It made code of conduct. So if you're walking down the street as an African American and a white man is approaching you, you have to step aside and take off your hat and address him as sir. You have to move out of your way and assume a role of subservience. Okay? And these laws lasted until 1964. Right? So for almost 100 years, about 90 years, these laws dominated Southern culture. Right? They are all examples of overt racism. Racism that is out in the open and very much on the surface. And so out of these Jim Crow laws, the South reenacted slavery. They were able to reinstitute slavery, but it was under a different name. So one form that they did this was through this idea called sharecropping. Does anyone know what the word sharecropping means? Yeah, Carson.
It's like where you work on like someone else's land, but you don't own it.
Exactly. You work on someone else's land. So what would happen is plantation owners had all this land, but they no longer had workers to work that land for them. So what they would do is they would rent out small parcels of that land to African American families. And then the plantation owner would provide all the materials necessary for farming. He would provide the seeds, he would provide the tools, he would provide the machinery in exchange for the African Americans giving him their crops. So it was a form of renting, but the African Americans were never able to make money because everything they produced went back to the plantation owner. And what this did, if you are an African American family and you never make any money because everything that you generate goes back to your plantation owner, you never have disposable income, so you can never move away. You can never go find a new place to live, you can never better yourself, and you can never better your situation. So essentially you are a slave to that land, you are a slave to that land owner. He controls you, right? This is slavery in another name. The other way that they would do this was they utilized a loophole in the 13th Amendment. So as I said earlier, the 13th Amendment, this was the amendment that abolished slavery, but within that amendment there is a line that says you can be a slave if you are imprisoned. Okay, we're going to be looking at that in just a moment. But essentially it says that if you are found guilty and convicted of a crime and sent to prison, then they can force you to work. So has anyone ever heard of a chain gang? Okay, so this is where chain gangs arise. They would go through and they would arrest people, sometimes on faulty charges, sometimes on real charges, but then they would send them off to these labor camps, right? So this is a chain gang that's building a railroad. They're being forced against their will to build this railroad. Again, slavery in a different name. And some of the laws that they would utilize are vagrancy laws and curfew laws. So a vagrant is just somebody who's homeless, someone who doesn't have a home. So if you were an African American out traveling, say you're traveling from Peoria to Eureka, right? And you travel through Washington. As you were going through Washington, a police officer could stop you and say, where are you going? And you would say, I'm going to Eureka. And they say, well, where are you from? And they would say, I'm from Peoria. And you'd say, well, I don't think you have a home. I think you are a vagrant. So then they could arrest you. And once they arrested you, what could they do? They could make you work. They could turn you into a slave again. And the same with curfew laws. If an African American were to break curfew, be in town after dark, they could be arrested and sent to a prison camp. Now this last one here. Does anybody know what malicious mischief is? No? That's because this has no definition. This was a term that a judge or a sheriff or a policeman could use. They could accuse an African American of engaging in malicious mischief. Now that term is defined by whoever wants to define it, right? There is no definition. So they could trump up, they could create a charge, in order to produce these slaves. Okay? Any questions? No? All right. So now we're going to transition and we're going to be doing some primary source reading. Do you guys all remember what primary sources are? Right?
Yeah.
First-hand accounts. So Hayden, could you get the lights for me? So the first ones that you're going to look at are just the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There is one thing, we're going to read these first. There's a line in the 13th Amendment that I want you to underline. It is the loophole that they utilize for this. And then the second document is a set of black codes that was instituted by a town in Louisiana. And these black codes dictate or spell out what African Americans could and couldn't do within the town. Okay? And then on the back there are 4 questions, just asking you to do a bit of like reflecting upon and just asking some questions about the documents. So we're going to work, you can either work on your own or you can work in pairs with people around you. So read through these and answer those 4 questions. Okay? Get 10. I don't know what to do for you, Carson. Here you go. All right. So on that first page, under the 13th Amendment, there's something I want you guys to underline or highlight. So where it says, Section 1, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, so being forced to work without your permission, except as a punishment for a crime. That is the part I want you guys to underline or highlight. Okay? As you read the black codes, take notice of how often they say imprisonment is the punishment. Okay, they're going to say, if you break this law, you will be imprisoned, or they often offer up you can pay a fine. But they all say imprisonment because of this loophole, right? Because if you were imprisoned, what could they make you do? They could make you work. They could turn you back into a slave. So as you read those black codes, take note of how they utilize this term to create for their own good. Sound good? All right, so go ahead and as I said, you guys can work in partners or groups, small groups. Let's keep it to like 3 or 4. Or you can work individually, and I'll be around to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, and I'd like to have these 4 questions. If you could have these done by tomorrow, that'd be fantastic. Sound good? Reading the amendments I would rather you read the black codes first. Okay, after we read that 13th Amendment, if time is of the essence, I would rather you read the black codes that are in the middle part. Okay, I think those are going to be more important to what we're doing. But yes, and I will be around. If you guys could get out those half sheets from yesterday, I'll be coming around to collect those. Thank you. Daniel, what's your name? You could go ahead and pass these slips forward. Is this all for you guys?